Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Best 5 Years of American Literature. My name is Sarah Speltz, and I'm an Associate Director in the BU Alumni Relations Office. Today's webinar is sponsored by the Boston University Alumni Association and is offered as part of our Live to Learn alumni education program. Many of our educational programs are held on campus, but we offer both career-related and educational webinars because we want to connect with our alumni around the globe. And today we have alumni joining us from all over the world, with participants listening in from places like California, Connecticut, Florida, Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Maine, Michigan, North Carolina, and of course Massachusetts and many other states. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have a few notes. As you know, this webinar is being hosted on the Adobe Connect online meeting platform. If you experience any trouble with the audio or visual portions of this presentation, please contact Adobe Connect. I'm going to give you the number right now. It is 1-800-422-3623. Today's presentation is being recorded and will soon be available on the BU website, the Alumni Association website, which is www.bu.edu/alumni. Our speaker today is eager to answer your questions, and you can submit them anytime throughout the presentation using the Q&A chat box that you see right below the slides. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Presenting from the BU campus in Boston is Professor Maurice Lee. Maurice Lee is Chair and Professor of English. He holds a BA from Stanford and a PhD from University of California, Los Angeles. His scholarship focuses on authors such as Melville, Douglass, Poe, Stowe, Dickinson, and the Transcendentalists. His work tends to situate literature at the crossroads of intellectual and cultural history. He's currently studying how mass print culture and quantitative methods shape the relationship between numbers and aesthetics in 19th century American and British literature, a relationship that conditions current attitudes toward the digital humanities and accountability movement in education. Professor Lee, thanks again for being with us today. I will pull up your slide deck, but the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I hope everyone can hear me all right. This is my first webinar ever, so if anything goes wrong, I know Sarah will help me out on the technological side. It's a little odd to be talking to people, not being able to see people's faces and reactions. So if you do want to make a comment as we go, please put it into the chat box, and I'm looking forward to answering questions and being a little bit more interactive at the end of the talk. So let me start with some confessions about this webinar. It's titled The Best 5 Years of American Literature, but that really isn't accurate. We'll actually be focusing on a period of literary history that spans about a decade. And I don't think the year that we'll be discussing years that can unequivocally be called the best. One point of this lecture is that judgments about the quality of literature are always shifting. They're always under dispute. I should also say that we won't be talking only about America. Literary studies has traditionally organized itself around national terms, but scholars are increasingly disrupting such categories by pursuing more international and cosmopolitan lines of inquiry. And finally, this webinar won't be only about literature. We'll also be discussing history and culture as well. So now that you know that my title is a conglomeration of half-truths and lies, let me start by noting a truly amazing coincidence. It turns out that the best 5 years of American literature happen to coincide with my own area of specialty, 19th century American literature, particularly in the decades before the Civil War. So surprise. There are certainly arguments to be made for other remarkable stretches in American literary history. For instance, you can see on this slide, between 1899 and 1904, a number of really prominent works were published. This is the time of literary realism and naturalism, and is dominated by fiction. I almost put Edith Wharton's House of Mirth on this slide, but it wasn't published until 1905. Some of these authors may be unfamiliar to you or only a vague memory, or have left a stronger impression. And just as an aside, a few years ago I ran into a student in a coffee shop who I'd had in class, maybe 5 or 6 years before. And we were trying to recall the specific course we had had together. And then she said, "Oh, yeah, I remember we read Sister Carrie." And I was thinking, this is one of those golden moments that remind you why it's so great to be a teacher. And then the student said, "God, I hated that book." So this list and the few others I'll be putting up today aren't really intended to pronounce some final judgment, and they're not meant to shame you into thinking you haven't been as well read as you might be. Really, I'm just trying to give a plausible account of major works. So then, plausibly, another period of concentrated literary achievement occurred between 1922 and 1927, with major works coming from modernist poets. Here you see T.S. Eliot and Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams. And other modernists, such as Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Stein, and Cather, contributed influential novels. Also, at the bottom of the list, you can see important works from the Harlem Renaissance. Jean Toomer, Langston Hughes, um, and Alain Locke are on here as well. Now, you might think of other exceptional periods in American literary history, and who knows, but we might be living in one right now. But in my mind, an especially rich, concentrated, and influential period comes between 1850 and 1855. This is my period. So during this period, you have Emerson. Many of his best essays actually appeared in the 1840s, but he was still producing important speeches and essays in the early 1850s and beyond. Emerson was the most prominent American intellectual of the period. The Scarlet Letter, the most popular American long work in high schools today, was published in 1850. Hawthorne also wrote the Blithedale Romance in 1851 and the House of the Seven Gables in 1852. So it was a very productive period for him. We also, of course, have Moby-Dick, published in 1851, the great American novel. I don't know how many of you have ever read Moby-Dick or decided it was time for you to read Moby-Dick or started Moby-Dick and didn't finish it, but certainly this has left a major mark on American literary history. We also have Henry David Thoreau's Walden Pond, a memoir, a compilation of nature writing, a counterculture manifesto, and now really an environmentalist touchstone. So that's a major work. And also Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, that free verse epic, the first major work of experimental poetry in the U.S. and one that's been widely influential, really in world literary history. So these are 5 major works published in this 5-year period. And I'm hardly the first person to notice this concentration. To understand how these texts and authors became canonized, how they rose to such prominence in American literary history, I want to go back a couple centuries. Now, it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that literature and English began to enter American college curriculum, and the focus was originally on British works. American literature didn't really enter college curriculum until around the 1860s and 1870s, and interestingly, it didn't do so at Harvard or Yale, but in colleges for women. And the reason for this is that American literature was seen as a somewhat frivolous, somewhat ornamental subject, unworthy of serious scholarly attention. Think of how film studies was regarded a few decades ago, or how courses on, say, video games or television might be considered by some more traditional people today. Now, this changed by the beginning of the 20th century as American literature became a fact of life in most American universities. And the story of American literature during this period sounded something like this. British colonists, particularly the Puritans, planted the seeds of American literary and cultural achievement. Their commitments to reading, writing, and freedom set the stage for the achievements of the founding fathers. But it really wasn't until the middle of the 19th century, until around 1850 and 1855, that American literature became a distinctive and self-aware tradition. Now, this older account of American literary history reached a kind of culmination in 1941, when a Harvard professor named F.O. Matthiessen published a book titled American Renaissance. The book focused on the 5 texts and authors you see on your computer in front of you now, and it recognized that the period between 1850 and 1855 was exceptionally fertile. Mathiessen's book was incredibly influential, and even to this day, some people will still refer to the middle period, the middle decades of the 19th century as the American Renaissance. For generations, Mathiessen's famous 5 authors were set at the head of the American literary canon. They were the Mount Rushmore of American literature, except I guess there were 5 people, so maybe they were the Jackson 5 of American literature. Let's assume that Matthiessen and the generations of scholars after him were right, that the years between 1850 and 1855 constitute one of the best and most important and most influential periods of American literature. And the question I want to ask now is why? Why such an outpouring of great books? And to answer this question, I'll cycle through a number of possibilities, none of which are mutually exclusive or adequate in and of themselves. These are intertwining explanations that should give us some sense for the complex ways we can think about literary history and achievement. If you want a straight and simple answer, I apologize. I'm an English professor, after all. Okay, so why this major outpouring of great works in this 5-year period before the Civil War? Okay, possibility number 1, cultural maturation. One explanation for the best 5 years of American literature can sound something like this. It took time for the United States to accumulate enough history, confidence, and cultural capital to produce great literature. Implicit here is the idea that great literature is an expression of a distinctive national character, that the United States needed time to break away from its tutelage to Britain and create an original literature reflecting its status as a new democratic nation on a new continent. This kind of logic reflects a long tradition of American exceptionalism. The belief that the United States is a specially destined nation, unbound by the usual rules of human history. In this way, the American Renaissance was really a matter of time and maturation, of an inevitable growth towards greatness, a kind of literary manifest destiny, if you will. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is transatlantic influences. One problem with the cultural maturation explanation is that American literature between 1850 and 1855 is highly influenced by British romantics, who in turn were influenced by German romanticism. So Emerson, Coleridge, and Schelling, Melville, Carlyle, and Kant, Whitman, Wordsworth, and Hegel. We can read the great authors of the American Renaissance as part of a transatlantic romantic tradition. Keep in mind, too, that the transatlantic expansion of print culture, that's when technological advances in paper making and printing and transportation and literacy and distribution meant that American writers were not just writing for local audiences, they were writing with British literary audiences in mind. And they were intensely interested in European and global literature as well. So in some ways, we can't separate off American literary history. It was part of a more global, more transatlantic literary marketplace. Okay, so transatlantic influences might help explain this sudden upwelling of great works between 1850 and 1855. Now, possibility number 3, the Cold War. It's no coincidence that the American Renaissance was fully established in the period following World War II. This is when people like Thoreau and Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, and Melville really became seen as the great figures of the 19th century for American literary critics. Why in the Cold War? Well, the Cold War was conceived not simply as a military contest between the Soviet Union and the United States, but also as a grand cultural struggle between the forces of tyranny and freedom. In American Renaissance, Matthiessen argued that his authors were all committed to what he called, quote unquote, the possibilities of democracy. And scholars working after Matthiessen often characterized Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, Hawthorne, and Melville as champions of individual rights, free thinking, and American exceptionalism. The American Renaissance thus became a reflection of the so-called American character at a time when American values were taken to be under external and internal threat. This helped justify American literary studies and also its funding in the name of national defense. You could build bombs to protect yourself from the Russians. You could also inoculate readers by having them read Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman, etc., from any potential subversion by communist or socialistic forces. Okay, so that's the Cold War explanation. Number 4 is Emerson, the cow. Writing of his famous 5 authors, Matthiessen called Emerson, quote, the cow from which the rest drew their milk, end quote. And indeed, Emerson had a massive influence on American literature before the Civil War. Thoreau, for a time, was a disciple of his fellow Concordian and served as a handyman in Emerson's household. He even lived on Emerson's land when he went to Walden Pond. And Thoreau had his differences with Emerson, but they were very close as both thinkers and as colleagues. Hawthorne was also a friend of Emerson, and he wrote his short story collection, Mosses from an Old Manse, at a home that Hawthorne rented from the Emerson family. Hawthorne did not subscribe to all of Emerson's transcendental beliefs, but his disagreements were often inspiring. For instance, Hester Prynne from the Scarlet Letter can be read as a female version of Emerson. This is arguments that other scholars have made. Walt Whitman did not meet Emerson until after Whitman published Leaves of Grass in 1855. And one of the first things he did was send Emerson a copy of his book. Emerson responded with an admiring letter that Whitman then reprinted in his 1856 edition of Leaves of Grass without asking Emerson's permission to do so. It was bad form, but the two men retained good relations even after Emerson asked Whitman to turn down the sexuality in some of his later poems. For his part, Melville never met Emerson, but he read Emerson's works and attended one of his lectures, and afterwards Melville wrote, that is, quote, I do not oscillate in Emerson's rainbow, but I love all men who die. And so, for instance, we can read Captain Ahab of Moby-Dick as a character who embodies the destructive potential of Emersonian transcendentalism. Okay, so Emerson, the single figure of Emerson, might help explain why we have this sudden upwelling of great literature during this period. Another possibility, and a related one, is to think of the group as a team of friends and rivals. As dominant a figure as Emerson was, the American Renaissance is also shaped by other important connections. Thoreau and Hawthorne liked to walk together in the woods. Both men were notoriously reticent, and friends wondered what they talked about, or if they even talked at all. Melville also met Hawthorne during this time when he moved to the Berkshires, and Melville sent Hawthorne admiring, lyrical, and even sexual letters. Hawthorne's responses have been lost to history, but it's fun to speculate if Melville's enthusiasm was reciprocated. I won't try to list the many references that Mathiessen's 5 authors make to each other in their writings, but the richness and complexity of their dialogue is one reason that the American Renaissance is so attractive to scholars. It also suggests that periods of concentrated achievement benefit from a kind of network effect. Talented and ambitious individuals find inspiration, support, and competitive motivation from similarly talented and ambitious individuals. So think of Philadelphia's Constitutional Convention in 1787, or impressionistic painters gathering in Paris in the 1870s and 80s, or scientists working on the Manhattan Project, or tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley today. I think the notion of a networking or clustering effect is especially intriguing in the case of writing, because writing is a solitary and often lonely pursuit that also requires imagining sympathetic readers. A major theme in much American Renaissance literature is the tension between solitude and sociality, between isolation and understanding, between difference and commonality. Biographically, Mathiessen's famous 5 authors can all be taken to struggle with issues of intimacy, but they also have these connections that they made between each other that might have helped alleviate some of their intimacy problems and that might have spurred them on to greater creative achievements. Okay, possibility number 6, bias. What else do Mathiessen's main authors have in common? In strictly demographic terms, they are all white and they are all men. And they are all from Massachusetts or New York. You might notice that Poe died in 1849, but he didn't make it into Mathiessen's American Renaissance. And it may have something to do with the fact that Poe was associated with the South. Um, After Matthiessen published American Renaissance in 1941, American literary criticism entered a period of relative consensus, with few scholars challenging the fundamental importance of Melville, Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, and Whitman. But with the success of the modern civil rights movement, and as college campuses became more diverse, literary critics beginning in the 1970s and 80s charged that Mathiessen's American Renaissance reflected not so much the possibilities of democracy, but long-standing patriarchal and racist social orders that included the canon makers themselves, the white male professors working at elite and exclusionary institutions who were telling everybody who the great authors of American literature were. Many of these multicultural critics argued that traditional aesthetic criteria reflected a kind of privileged condition. Such standards valued literature as self-enclosed, otherworldly works of art, cordoned off or separate from political and cultural contexts. Such criteria, the argument went, allowed the canon makers to ignore some inconvenient truths. For example, Emerson, like most white people of his time, believed in biological theories of white male supremacy. Hawthorne disliked the anti-slavery movement, and he complained about the competition from female novelists, whom he once called, quote, a mob of scribbling women. Melville, Thoreau, and Whitman almost never write about women, and they could depict non-whites, including the Irish, who were seen as non-white at the time, in stereotypical and condescending ways. And it's not simply that Mathiessen's famous 5 held views that can offend some modern observers. Indeed, it would be shocking if they didn't. The deeper concern about the American Renaissance was that it represented a narrow and relatively homogeneous slice of American culture and literature that was valued precisely for its ability to evade legacies of inequality and injustice, to kind of retreat into a transcendental artistic realm and not talk about the hard truths of American democracy. And so beginning around the 1980s, the canon underwent some substantial changes. In the field of American literature before the Civil War, new writers came to attention. Women authors like Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lydia Maria Child, Margaret Fuller, and Emily Dickinson. Writers of color such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, William Wells Brown, and William Apis. Some traditionalists defended the value of Mathiessen's old canon, that is, Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, etc., and they critiqued the new multicultural texts and the political justifications for including them in classrooms and on curriculum. But the multicultural scholars were in many ways victorious. New authors and texts entered the canon and entered classrooms. Mathiessen's famous 5 lost some of their market share, if you will, and literary scholarship increasingly emphasized political contexts and social themes. And yet, at least 2 funny things happened on the way to the end of the American Renaissance. The first is that Mathiessen's famous 5 remained highly influential. And so about a year and a half ago, I was scheduled to give a talk on the state of the field at a major conference for 19th century American literary scholars. And what you typically do during a talk like this is you step back and you opine on what you think is important in the field and where you think the field is headed. And in preparation, what I did was I solicited through the conference's listserv 130 syllabi from colleagues who teach survey courses on 19th century American literature. A graduate student and I crunched the numbers to see which authors between 1800 and 1865 were most represented on the syllabi that I received. And here's what we found, and I think it's very interesting. So here are the top 10 authors as they were represented on syllabi. And as you can see, Melville, Hawthorne, Whitman, Emerson, and Thoreau are very much still highly represented on syllabi and represent a kind of canon. But let me make a few other points as well. We can probably now talk about a top 9 or even a top 11 group of authors. On our next slide, you'll see after Washington Irving, who's here on the right, the percentages really fall off. So if Mathiessen's famous 5 used to absolutely dominate our sense of American literature before the Civil War, here you can see the canon has been diversified. Frederick Douglass has cracked the top 5. We have Emily Dickinson and others, including Poe, Stowe, and Irving. And here are the authors number 11 through 20, and you can get another sense of how of people who are also represented. If you notice on the left there, Harriet Jacobs. Really, she could be in the top 11. I just didn't put her on that slide. So this is, at least by this rough survey I did, a kind of indication of what people are teaching it. What was most interesting about this data to me is the wide variety of responses it generated at the conference. Some of my colleagues were surprised, others were not. Some were pleased that the canon had been to some degree expanded and diversified. Others were outraged that things had changed so little. And some people rightfully pointed out that the data only reflects survey courses, which tend to be more traditional in their content. Now, what the data suggests to me, and in accord with my general sense of the field, is that an early multicultural critique of Mathiessen's famous 5 turns out to be somewhat misguided. That is, it turns out that Emerson, Whitman, Melville, Hawthorne, and Thoreau, these original Big 5, may be privileged and susceptible to all sorts of biases, but they were also quite committed to, and at times insightful about, cultural and political issues. For instance, scholars initially tended to understand Moby-Dick as a book about art and philosophy. But Melville's novel is also politically charged in very specific ways. Moby-Dick has significant African and Polynesian characters, depicts the challenges and joys of multi-ethnic communities, and when the white narrator Ishmael wonders in chapter 1, who ain't a slave, that's Ishmael's quote, Melville invokes the slavery debate of the time. Similarly, Walt Whitman may not write much about women, but his poetry is very much interested in gender roles and the dynamics of heterogeneous sexualities. And if Thoreau was once applauded for retreating to Walden Pond, in effect rejecting modern society, Thoreau, it turns out, was also radically engaged in his culture, including its destruction of the wilderness, the spread of market capitalism and consumerism, and the turning of men into machines through slavery and industrialism. We might like to read Walden Pond as a retreat, but we can also read it very much as an attempt to engage problems in democracy during the time period. What I'm suggesting then is that as critical criteria changed with the rise of multiculturalism in the 1970s and 1980s, and as scholars became interested in different topics such as politics and social issues, and began reading different literature in different ways, when all this was happening, classic American Renaissance texts were not displaced so much as reinvigorated under new conditions. This isn't entirely accurate across the board. Hawthorne has seen some decline in his market share, for instance. I think, I'll go back on my slide here. I think if we did this 30 years ago, Hawthorne would have been ahead of Melville and by a long shot. And for instance, Melville's short story about a slave revolt, Benito Cereno, is now much more popular than his novella Billy Budd, which used to be much more read. So even if Melville is still popular, the prioritizing of his texts has changed under these new conditions. But despite all these changes, as I've said, Mathiessen's famous 5 have proved extraordinarily resilient and relevant. And here's another funny thing that happened on the way to the end of the American Renaissance. Some of the most important new canonical texts happened to fall in the period between 1850 and 1855. So for instance, here are our five major works from Mathiessen's American Renaissance. But then we can add some multicultural authors. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was published between 1850 and 1855. William Wells Brown wrote the first African-American novel, Clotel, in 1853. Frederick Douglass wrote his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, in 1855, and many critics, myself included, consider this his most important text. Emily Dickinson began writing her early poems in the late 1850s. I'm expanding our time period a little bit here. And Harriet Jacobs, the escaped African-American woman, wrote her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl in 1861. So whether we're talking about an old canon or a new canon, I'd still argue that from 1850 to 1855 remains the best 5 years of American literature. And if we expand it to the 1850s, it's an even stronger argument. And this leads me to my final explanation for the period's exceptional concentration of great texts. And I might actually have time to give you two more explanations. We'll see. So number 7 is a large and more diverse team, not just a team of friends and rivals. We can draw an even wider network of connections in the period formerly known as the American Renaissance. So for instance, Harriet Jacobs, the slave narrator, worked in an abolitionist reading room above the editorial office of Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York. And when Jacobs was looking for financial support, when she tried to publish her story, she wrote a letter to Harriet Beecher Stowe to try to get some support from Stowe, who was very famous at the time. Stowe offered to actually write Jacobs' narrative for her, and Jacobs refused, preferring to do it herself. Along similar lines, Stowe based her militant black hero in Uncle Tom's Cabin, a character named George Harris, on Frederick Douglass's autobiography. And Douglass published a positive review of Stowe's novel in the paper he edited, though Douglass was also a little concerned with depictions of African Americans in that novel. So like Mathiessen's famous 5, our newly canonized authors inspired, supported, and competed with each other, pushing themselves to greater literary achievements. And yet the model here is not of two separate networks or clusters of authors, for there are fascinating connections between Mathiessen's famous 5 and the women writers and authors of color who were supposedly going to supplant them. For instance, Emerson supported Stowe's inclusion in a formerly all-male Boston literary club called the Saturday Club, and Emerson also blackballed Frederick Douglass from that club because of his race. Thoreau first gave his famous civil disobedience speech at an abolitionist meeting in which he filled in for Douglass, who was unable to make the trip because of illness. Emily Dickinson was inspired by the writings of Emerson, but when Emerson gave a lecture in Amherst and was staying at the home of Emily Dickinson's brother, she decided against meeting the great man in person. Melville's Benito Cereno and Jacobs's Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl respond directly to Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we can point to any number of different relationships between all of these different texts and different authors. They were really engaging in a kind of conversation. And I'm gonna also tell you about my favorite possible connection from this time period. In late 1839 and early 1840, Herman Melville and Frederick Douglass were both living in New Bedford. Douglass was working on the dock moving barrels of whale oil, and Melville had just signed on for a whaling voyage and was waiting for his ship to leave. Soon after that, Melville was amassing the experiences that would lead to his career as a novelist. Experiences that included living and laboring on multiracial ship crews, working under tyrannical captains that acted like slave masters, and ruminating over the limits of freedom, metaphysical and political. So when Ishmael says, "Who ain't a slave?" it's both a philosophical and very much a political question. Within a year, Douglass in New Bedford would give, within a year of being in New Bedford at the same time that Melville was, Douglass would give his first speech before a wide audience, thus launching his celebrated career as an abolitionist speaker and author who, like Melville, would explore the political and philosophical possibilities of freedom. One thing you may notice at this point, and it's not a point I'm going to elaborate on here, but another explanation for why 1850 to 1855, or why the 1850s in general is this incredibly rich period of literature, is that the coming Civil War may have inspired authors to write more significant and more powerful works. One potential argument is, what do you do when you have a disagreement at a national level about a consuming topic like slavery? And what do you do when you don't want to go to war, but you cannot solve this dispute? And one answer is, you can just keep trying to use words more effectively. You can continue to try to write in better and more sensitive ways. You can try to convince your opponent of your position through more emotional, more dramatic, more compelling modes of narration. It's no coincidence that all of the authors, and again, I'll go back here, all of the authors here, to some degree, write very carefully and powerfully about the slavery crisis. And not just as a question of race, but as a question of nation, as a question of ethics, as a question of philosophy. How do you decide what's right and what is wrong? So the Civil War may be another reason why we have this great outpouring of literature during the 1850s. And I'll make one final point before I leave off here and try to answer any questions or entertain any comments you might have. I've been trying to trace this afternoon the complex reasons of why certain periods of literary history are especially productive and why certain literary works become canonized. Some reasons involve the quality of the texts themselves. Others involve historical forces during the time of the authors, and still others involve historical and institutional contexts that stretch into the 20th century and beyond. So we can talk about the actual quality of Moby-Dick, or we can talk about the social forces that shaped Herman Melville when he wrote Moby-Dick, or we can think about the social forces and the institutional forces that help create or canonize Moby-Dick in the 20th century when critics are beginning to create curriculum. Now, one recent factor that I haven't discussed, and that also seems to me particularly worrisome, is how the study of American literature is currently being shaped and not shaped by educational policy. It's not so much that a growing emphasis on the STEM fields risks marginalizing the humanities, though I do think that's true and I'm worried about it. And it's not so much that pressures to professionalize undergraduates, to train them specifically for specific careers, threatens the liberal arts as an educational model, though this too worries me. The worry I want to emphasize today is the accountability movement in education as it's currently operating in the United States. One problem is that literary studies is difficult to measure using standardized tests. Multiple choice exams and timed essay questions simply cannot do justice to the kind of learning, thinking, and enrichment that take place in literature courses and that take place when we sit down with literary books. The more emphasis we give to standardized tests, the less students will be encouraged to learn fundamental aspects of literary study, to be thoughtful readers, reflective readers, to be careful and recursive writers, and to sustain encounters with subjective methods and ambiguities that they might otherwise not turn to. Literature can nurture emotional intelligence and nurture moral intelligence. It can lead to self-understanding and deeper cultural awareness. Such things can be assessed by teachers, but they are difficult to measure with standardized tests. And one aspect of standardized testing is that you have to make sure all the students read the same thing. And what's an emphasis on standardized testing can encourage is a narrowing or shrinking of the canon. It's not fair to ask someone a standardized test about a book they haven't read. And so one concern I have under the kind of current accountability movement in literature is that the richness of this period, the richness of these works that were published in the 10 years before the Civil War might be lost if we try to shut down the canon and say, oh, these are the 3 or 4 books that everybody must read because they're going to be on some kind of national standardized test or Common Core curriculum. So I'll leave off here. And as I said, I'm happy to answer any questions. I know Sarah's going to moderate any questions or comments you have. And so thank you for your attention. And let me know what you think.
Great, thank you so much. So everyone, just a reminder, you can type your questions in the box at the bottom, and I will read them out loud so everyone can hear them. And we did have a question that was submitted during the presentation from David, so we'll start with that one. What was the impact of existentialism on these authors? It's interesting to note that they were all Unitarians. Did the sensibilities of their common religious beliefs have any influence on their writing and therefore this movement?
Okay, so that's a great question, and let me talk about some of the terms very briefly. So existentialism as a philosophy didn't exist as such in the 19th century. These authors are writing before Sartre, certainly, but also even before Nietzsche, which isn't to say that all of these authors aren't interested in existential questions. And so, just as a kind of an aside, this is just one of those odd connections that sometimes people don't recognize because it makes us think outside of our boxes a bit. Is Nietzsche was a huge fan of Emerson, and the story is that he carried a book of Emerson's essays in his jacket pocket wherever he went. And if you read Nietzsche, a number of Emersonian concepts and even kind of quotations start to emerge. So that's just one indication that you can certainly read these authors through an existential model. Now, in terms of Unitarianism, which is different, a context that I wasn't able to talk about is all of these authors are writing at a time of religious turmoil in the United States. Some traditional modes of Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, are beginning to give way to a different sort of religious belief, Unitarianism among them. All of these authors, however, weren't necessarily Unitarian. So Melville, for instance, came from a Calvinist background. Stowe came from a kind of Reformed Calvinist background. Douglass, William Wells Brown, and Harriet Jacobs wouldn't have recognized the kind of sectarian differences between a standard Protestantism or an evangelical Protestantism and Unitarianism. All of which is to say that there's religious diversity amongst these groups, I mean, within Protestantism, but also that they were living through a time of transition where religious convictions were less stable, and that can also be an explanation for why you get this outpouring of incredibly thoughtful and profound literature. I think all of these authors can be seen as having a religious crisis at various points in their life. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. And I've noticed a couple people who are participating have tried to raise their hand. We don't have the audio enabled, so please type in your questions, and I will see them. I'll read them out loud for you. So, Dr. Lee, you mentioned at the beginning that a period when concerns over American values and other things justified literary studies. And I know now a lot of people have to justify the funding and emphasis on the arts and humanities, and of course that includes the study of literature. Do you see anything going on right now that is similar that creates an argument for you that all of your students should be taking classes in the English department all the time?
Yeah, well, it's, I'm obviously a biased observer here. I want everybody to take English courses. If you look at the history of literary studies in universities and in secondary schools, the humanities, the arts have always felt themselves to be in a kind of crisis. They've always felt the need to have to justify what they do in ways that, say, mathematics or engineering or applied chemistry or something does not feel the need to justify. So in some ways, the kind of concerns that I and others have right now are not that different than concerns that literary people had um, hundreds of years ago. And so I'll just an example. If you read Emerson's The American Scholar, he complains about how Americans are only concerned about practicality and material gain and the immediate effects of knowledge, as opposed to kind of the broader effects that we like to talk about in the humanities. Things like ethical growth, the creation of character, the enjoyment and pleasure of aesthetic wonder. He complains that these things are marginalized in the 1830s and 1840s, and that hasn't changed as much today. I think what has changed is the cost of education, the dominance right now of science and technology, especially big data. All of these can be seen as threatening to literary studies, but my argument would be the basic needs and hungering after fundamental and profound truths, that hasn't changed. And the students that I see at BU um, uh, support that belief because your big data is not going to solve all of our problems. It's not going to speak to all of our needs, and the kind of needs that literature speaks to um, have been part of the human experience since recorded history. So that gives me confidence, or at least hope.
Good. Elliot has a question. What was the influence of Bronson Alcott and American transcendentalism on these authors?
Oh, that's great. So Bronson Alcott was a transcendentalist and a friend of Emerson and Thoreau. He was known as a better speaker and conversationalist than he was a writer. He did publish a number of articles and a few books. They were not as influential. They're written at a very high and abstract level. And so they didn't get the same kind of response that Emerson and Thoreau got. But he, again, because of this network effect that I was alluding to, he's very much a part of the achievement of this period. What also I didn't get to mention is Bronson Alcott, of course, is the father of Louisa May Alcott, the famous author of Little Women. And if you're interested in a depiction of a less than flattering depiction of Bronson Alcott, you can read Louisa May Alcott's essay called it's called Transcendental Oats. She didn't publish it until after her father died. One of the criticisms of Bronson Alcott was that he spent all of his time thinking and writing about higher transcendental truths, but his family was living in dire poverty at the time, and so his children, and particularly his wife, suffered and worked desperately hard to keep the family afloat while he speculated about the higher truths of the universe. And that's a critique that people made of transcendentalism in general, that it was insufficiently attentive to the materialities and practicalities of the world. So thank you for that question, Elliot.
Yes. We have a couple minutes if anyone has any additional questions. And in the meantime, I may throw you a bit of a curveball here, which is to ask, I recently read about a video game that's being developed that is about Walden Pond and Thoreau. And I don't know if you've heard about that, or just, what your reaction is when you hear that there's going to be a video game made about Walden Pond.
Yeah, I saw something about that. I think it was in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that one of the interesting things about the game is it's a game that's designed to be slow and reflective and to allow people to pay attention to the visual details of the game in a kind of more speculative way, and that the goals of the game, it's not a clear path to victory in the game. The goal is not, to kill all the aliens or to find the treasure or to get through the maze. The goal is just to sort of wander about Walden, and you can do lots of different activities and sort of get aesthetic pleasure from that. I suppose I prefer that video game than a shooting up aliens game. At the same time, I wonder if the time spent playing that video game might just be better spent finding a little bit of nature yourself and experiencing those sort of pleasures directly. I guess, and I'm sure there are some people who don't have the opportunity to go into nature, or maybe physically, or they live in a city or something like that. So maybe the game would be good on that score. But I myself personally, I'll just go to Walden Pond.
Which is great. We live close to it, so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think we will wrap up, and this will be posted on our website. So if any of you want to come back and review this list, or soak up more wisdom from Professor Lee, you'll have that opportunity. Professor Lee, we're so grateful for you taking this time to share your expertise with your fellow terriers. And I thank all of you for participating. Oh, go ahead. Did you want to say one more thing?
I was just going to say thank you, Sarah, and thank everybody out there in the BU universe for listening.
Yes, I thank you as well. And we'll hope to have you on a webinar or at an event on campus sometime soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.